We're really happy today to have two presenters talking about the issue of deer and deer browse on forest health across the lake states. And so our first two speakers for the day. First will be Christel Kern, followed by John Geisler, and they'll each do about 20-25 minutes of presenting and then answering questions as they come in as well. And so just kind of an introduction to the WebEx system. You should be seeing the slides for Christel's slides showing first, managing deer browse for forest health. And then you should also see over on the right-hand side a chat area. And we really encourage you to post questions, type questions, comments into that chat area. And we can relay those to Christel and John as we go through the slides this afternoon. And so it's really a great time and a good time to get feedback, ask additional questions to the speakers. And so we really encourage you to do that. And in that chat area, we'll also be sharing some links to resources that both Christel and John mentioned throughout the webinar. And so with that, I think I'll introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Christel Kern. Christel is with the U.S. Forest Service, the Northern Research Station in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. And she's going to be chatting about managing deer browse for forest health and really some insights from the Great Lakes Silviculture Library. So with that, Christel, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a beautiful summer day here in Rhinelander, so I hope everything is well by you as well. I'm a research forester for the Northern Research Station. I've been in my position about 7 years. That's me in the lower right with my two children. And we're contributing to some deer management, population management, and alleviating some of the browse in that local area, little seedlings. So this is a family activity for us. Well, I'm going to be giving an overview and an introduction to deer and deer browse, looking at some of the research and some general management ideas, and then I'll turn it over to John, who will have a more detailed case study to share with you. So white-tailed deer is the animal of interest today. Their range runs through the Americas. Here in the United States, they're largely found east of the Rockies. In the Lake States, in pre-settlement times, the population was estimated around 5 to 10 deer per square mile. Today, there is a lot of variation from these historical levels, as you can see in the lower right figure. Some populations are still at that historical level, and some are above that. White-tailed deer are considered generalist, meaning they're very adaptable to a wide range of habitats. And you can see in the photo in the upper right, deer residing in an urban area. White-tailed deer are a natural part of our ecosystem. Here in the Lake States, they're one of the largest herbivores, and they play a very important part in our food web. And I have an example of a food web here. As primary consumers, they provide food and energy up the food chain to animals such as wolves. And as primary consumers, they also get their energy and food from plants or the producers in this food web. So they're very well linked within our ecosystems, and they have important influences on plant communities. The random and preferential browsing and grazing of herbivores can be important to plant communities. At optimal levels of browsing and grazing, plant diversity can be maintained. For example, bison can maintain plant diversity in tall grass prairies. The bison provide the necessary disturbance that allow a variety of plants to coexist in the same site and same ecosystem. On the other hand, too much browsing and grazing can have negative effects on plant communities, such that the preferred food source or plant species can be locally decimated, and that non-preferred food source or plant species begin to dominate the forest understory. Browse is defined as the consumption of tender shoots, twigs, and leaves of trees and shrubs that are food for animals. Overbrowsing can affect tree seedlings in the future of our forests. Let's look at some examples from research. I had a study in northern Wisconsin between 1997 and 2008. Here we looked at browsing on natural tree regeneration in the forest understory for 12 years. We compared our browsing numbers with the local estimates of the deer population, and we found that browsing impacts and the deer population tracked very well. At our study site, we implemented a deer exclusion study where we used fencing to protect some planted seedlings from the deer. So we planted hemlock, white pine, yellow birch, and red oak in fenced areas and in unprotected areas in the forest understory. After 4 years, hemlock and white pine had different survival rates. These two species were more likely to survive behind the fencing than in the unprotected areas. So the interpretation here is that browsing is a factor in influencing the composition of our future forests, away from species such as this that are preferred palatable species. We also found after 4 years that there were greater gains in height for hemlock and yellow birch. Yellow birch that were grown in the fenced areas were 4.5 inches taller than unprotected yellow birch, and hemlock were 1.5 inches taller in the fenced areas. The interpretation here was that browsing was another factor, a factor in reducing height growth and slowing the development of that future forest. There have been many studies of fencing in the region showing similar results at different sites, states, and forest types. So this is just a sample of some of them. In general, we find there's more stems, more biomass, more basal area, more shrubs and forbs, and greater plant diversity in these fenced areas. This suggests that our forests, which are not fenced, are experiencing the impacts of deer, and those impacts vary with the density of deer in the local area. For example, Mike Walters and others from Michigan State University studied deer and forest regeneration in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Some of the impacts that they found were spatially important. In this graph, on the y-axis is stem density, and on the x-axis is distance to lowland conifer forest, or the winter deer yards. You can see in general that the closer the seedlings were to a winter deer yard, the lower densities there were compared to being farther away, especially for a species like sugar maple, which is this first or green bar. Note that there's other spatial factors that influence browsing, such as available food, land use, disturbance history, snow cover, just to name a few. Within a stand, browse can affect forest composition and structure too. In this graph, there's a sugar maple panel here. This time we have the density of stems is on the X, and height size class is on the Y. The colors of the bars represent deer density, low deer density, and high deer density. And each bar represents the number of stems found at that height. So for sugar maple, when we looked at when these colleagues looked at areas of high and low deer density, there was similar numbers of sugar maple in the upper portions of these forest sites. However, in the lower portions of the canopy, there was less sugar maple found in areas with high deer populations, and in some cases, no sugar maple found. In this panel is for ironwood. You can see in the upper portions of the forest canopy, it's only at sites with high deer populations that ironwood was found. And in the lower portions, ironwood continues to dominate And when you compare this to the sugar maple at these high deer density sites, ironwood is filling in this niche or this height class at the expense of sugar maple. So what does this mean? Well, seeing the abundance and dominance of ironwood in the upper layers suggests that the deer browse has been impacting this site for quite some time. And looking at the dominance in the lower canopy suggests that the impact is going to continue for years to come. Deer and herbivores do have preferences, such as browsing sugar maple over ironwood. And these types of preferences can have important local and regional impacts on forest stand dynamics. Here's a list of some of the tree species here in the Lake States, and they're rated according to a few different sources for palatability, where 1 is low palatability and 4 is more palatable. So we are just talking about ironwood and the preference of eating sugar maple, a number 2, over ironwood. So this is just an example of palatability, but actual palatability is going to change by location, region, season, and other factors. Will McWilliams from the Forest Service FIA, some of us from the Northern Research Station, and our collaborating universities put together a study of the potential risks to regeneration failure in these areas with high deer populations. This study used FIA data, their tree species and composition information, and plot level assessments of browse. The red areas on this map indicate areas where the potential for moderate to high browse impacts to tree regeneration are severe, while the blue indicates the opposite. The map shows that the risk to forest regeneration and sustainability cannot be ignored in large portions of the eastern United States. So how do we mitigate this situation? Well, theoretically, we would manage the deer population, maintain enough food for the deer, but keep the impacts low and tree regeneration success high. However, achieving this balance isn't as easy as it looks on the food pyramid that I showed you early in the presentation. There's many social issues and other complexities in managing the deer at local and regional levels. This leaves us in a situation where we have to manage under these circumstances. So the problem is the intersection of areas of high deer populations and areas we want to sustain as forests, notably areas where these forests are dominated by palatable species. How do we regenerate these forests under these circumstances? Well, when we know this is the situation, there are some options we can try at the stand level. At a site with known and potentially severe browse impacts, you can use some protection strategies. I mentioned the positive effects of fencing earlier in the presentation. Michigan DNR has used temporary fencing in browse problem areas to grow seedlings above the reach of deer, and then move that fencing to another area. You also could use tree tubes, repellents, and bud caps. While all of these methods have been proven to be effective, they can also be very cost prohibitive and unrealistic for large areas. One protection method that might be cost effective, depending on your contract situation, is utilizing material already on site to create barriers to deer movement and access, such that a sapling can escape browse and grow above a deer's reach. In this photo, a large white pine crown was a natural barrier to deer, allowing this yellow birch to grow over 6 feet in an area known for its high deer population. Sometimes this is called cribbing. In Europe, strategically moving large debris like this to protect advance regeneration, or create within stand quote-unquote cribs has been used in some timber sales. Another approach is to regenerate a dense layer of trees where the dominant species is not preferred, these X's on here, and a subdominant species is palatable. This is called associational resistance. It's these less palatable species that block or hide the more palatable species from the browsers. A similar but different approach is to regenerate many, many stems of the palatable species such that there is enough food for the deer, but also enough stems out there to survive and outgrow the reach of the deer. Shelter woods are used in this way to regenerate oak hickory forests in the mid-Atlantic states. Here in the Lake States, I worked with Kyle Schmidt of the Wisconsin DNR to provide an example of this in swamp hardwoods in northern Wisconsin. This stand was located near farms, an area known for its high deer population. So his strategy was to overwhelm the deer with a very dense regeneration layer. In the winter of 2008, a strip clear cut was implemented. 200-foot cut area, 200-foot leave areas. 10 years later, this approach was deemed a success, with over 4,000 stems per acre. You can learn more details about this prescription in the Great Lakes Silviculture Library in the link below. At this time, I'm going to end the overview of research and management of deer browsing impacts on tree regeneration and turn it over to John for a more detailed case study.
Great. Thank you, Christel. We'd be happy to, if you do have questions for Christel, just as a reminder to type them into the chat area, and that's in the lower right in the WebEx system, and we can relay those to Christel as you have those questions. I'm not seeing any questions come in now, but I guess, Christel, one question kind of as you went through your slides, certainly the lake states have multiple kinds of owners, ranging from federal national forest land to state agencies to private landowners. So what kinds of things do you notice about different things that people are trying related to protecting for deer, or maybe across different ownerships?
Well, when I was in Minnesota, private landowners were trying the bud capping. They had the resources and time to try that protection approach. Working with some of the national forests, I've seen a lot of the protection strategies of using repellents on the planted seedlings that they're putting out. And as I mentioned, some of the DNR agencies using temporary fencing in areas where they know they have high deer populations and are really focused on regenerating specific areas.
Great. Thanks, Christel. Well, not seeing any other questions coming in online. So with that, I think we'll transition to John's presentation. So we're really happy now to have John Geissler. John is with the St. John's Abbey Arboretum, and he is the land manager there. And so he's going to be talking about, I looked at his slides just a little while ago, and there's some great photos of the Arboretum. And more specifically, I think he's going to be touching on a case study that has been published on the Silviculture Library related to deer management. And so with that, John, feel free to take it away.
Great, thanks, Matt. So I'm here at St. John's, just west of St. Cloud, and we're about 10 miles west of St. Cloud on Interstate 94, and we have about 3,000 acres. We're right on this kind of unique convergence of the prairie from the west, meeting the eastern deciduous forest, and then conifers to the north. So we have about around 700 acres that's primarily oak. which is the dark orange on the map there, and then northern hardwoods, lighter orange. And then I'll just zero in that tree cookie on the left is a 241-year-old oak, white oak that died a few years ago. It would have been an acorn in 1776. So some just beautiful oaks here. And we're really focused on trying to get a new generation of oaks started here. And just resilience to climate change and gypsy moth that's on its way, and a number of different stressors that we want to have a diversity of age classes. So this is what campus looked like in the 1870s. The monks arrived in this area about 1860. You can see it took a lot of wood to heat the quadrangle there. A lot of the area was cut, and so there weren't a lot of deer at that time, not a lot of predators, not much for turkeys or bear. And so what came back is this nice oak forest. It's oak dominated, and most of our oaks are between 120 and 150 years old. It's a mix of red oak and white oak, but you'll see there's not much coming up for new regeneration. So I'd say in the last 30 years, we've been focused on doing oak shelterwood cuts. We'd have great, on good acorn years, we'd have really good regeneration. We'd have all these little seedlings popping up, but then they'd all get browsed off. We tried to overwhelm them with big numbers, but our deer populations were around 30 per square mile. We're also a game refuge, so we got permission to start holding deer hunts in 1998, controlled hunts, and I think we have our populations down around 20 per square mile. So this just shows what comes up. Christel did a great job explaining that they don't like ironwood as well as they do all the other species. So we have mature oaks that have been clear shelterwood cuts through them, and all you have coming up underneath is ironwood, just because none of the oaks can make it up through there. They just get browsed out, preferentially browsed. So to kind of rehab some of these shelterwood cuts, we've done a couple different methods. We've done prescribed burns. We actually raked away coarse woody debris away from all the major stems, ran fire through, and you can see in the upper right was effective in knocking back the ironwood. We've also used kind of a brush hog approach where we just go through the woods and kind of chop up all the ironwood in preparation for planting or natural regen. We collect our own acorns and plant them. The DNR grows them for us, and then we buy them back and plant them. So we have our own seed source. And after that, we have to protect them in some way. So we get them going. We've tried tree tubes like this, and we've had it's better than nothing, but about 40% make it through, and very slowly. So I'm not a huge fan of this method. We've gone more now to fence deer exclosures. So anywhere from 4 acres enclosed to over 20 acres enclosed. But we found that 20 acres is almost too big. It's hard to patrol the entire line, and if a deer gets in there, they feel like they're not inside anything. So we found about 4 acres of nice, and after every windstorm, you have to check these fences because trees go down, and you don't want all your work eaten up. So Matt mentioned we have one case study currently on the Silviculture library, and you can look on the details of that one. It gives a little history, and Tom Kroll, my predecessor, has a video on there talking about this stand. But I'm going to kind of talk about some current, or the next, what we're working towards now in some of our deer exclosures. So this map shows all of we have 6 deer exclosures, and the one in the Silviculture library is this one right here. And now I'm going to go to the next one. So here we have the next problem that you get once you fence it off. You get, in these mesic sites, everything wants to grow. The growing space is there, and it just wants to get up and go. So you have prickly ash, you have raspberries, you have blackberries, everything with thorns is in there. And basically the young oaks, they'll hang out underneath this layer for about 5 years, but then they'll eventually just peter out. There's not enough sunlight getting down to them. So the challenge is, once you get your oaks protected, is what are you going to do to get sunlight down to those oaks? And so we've tried, we're trying a couple different things. So one thing we've tried are these Vispor mats. We just put them down last fall. We cleared around each seedling and put down these mats. And the idea being that this is kind of a buffer where we can go around then and brush saw around once those raspberries and blackberries will actually encroach over the top of these mats. And so you can see this summer we've gone through and in the height of deer fly season and go through and release around these. And I think it's going to take a couple of years of doing this. I mean, this is highly intense management, but we really are serious about trying to get some oak started. So we've done that, and then that's under a shelter wood currently, and so we're going to wait till those get up to about waist height, and then we'll take the overwood off, and then even if we clip off some of those oaks, they'll have enough root to send the seedling up and hopefully to sapling stage above the competition. This is another experiment we're doing here, a different exclosure. It's about 4 acres, and you can see what it looks like before on the left, and there was actually quite a bit of advanced regen in here, so I didn't want to chop it all off. We went through and actually we had enough, we have a huge volunteer base here, so we actually hand pruned in the winter all of these, all the competition basically. There were some areas, I'll kind of give you an overview of this yellow area. There wasn't much advanced regen, so I tried about a 2 acre clear cut, and then we planted back inside that 2 acre clear cut. This area that's in green had a lot of good advanced regeneration under a shelter wood, so we left that as shelter wood, but hand cleared all the ironwood and competition around the oaks through there. And then the red areas, we didn't do anything. We just left all the competition and see how the oaks do within that. So here's a view. This is an after shot now. So this is that 2 acre piece that we clear cut. We came back in the spring and planted oak within here, about 435 per acre, and then matted them right away. And this was a lot easier matting right away because we had kind of just done a light scrape with our skidder to get all the brush away, and really saved a lot of time so we can mat right away. And then you can see further on in the picture, every one of these wood stakes is an existing oak tree. We also there's some areas that didn't have regen within them, so we back planted those areas and matted those as a comparison between the clear cut and the shelter wood. And then I've actually run transects for my master's thesis through here, and we're going to look at how the regen does over the next few years. So here's another view looking from the area looking back up the hill. So this is the clear cut up here where you just saw the mats, so you can see everything starting to grow up around it a little later in the spring. You can see the matted oaks that were planted, and then this one over here is one of those advanced regens. It's looking pretty nice now that it has access to sunlight. And I think my next idea too is maybe taking advantage of some of that deer browse. So Christel had mentioned, kind of cutting strips, clear-cut strips. Then I would mat, and then I want to try just putting these 2-foot diameter cages around the oaks, and then let the deer browse all around them, and kind of put them to work as our clearing crew. But we'll see, and then I could reuse these easily, because with the fences, they tend to stay there for, it's just a lot of work to remove, and it's hard to reuse the materials. This, with 2 rebar and a fence, we can move these from place to place once these oaks get above deer height. So that's kind of my next trial. And all these studies, eventually, as I collect the data, will be published on the Great Lakes Silviculture Library. So stay tuned for that. And with that, I think I'm going to open it up to questions, or I would love to hear suggestions or ideas from the audience on different things I should be trying or things to watch for. I always like to learn myself.
Great. Well, thanks, John. Yeah, I do encourage people to type questions that you have for John or Christel as well, and also comments to John's point as well. A question for you, John, that's coming in online. Does St. John's manage for coppice at all, or are the trees too large or too old to coppice very well?
Most of them are too old, so we do get a little bit, but most of them are past that prime. So.
And then another question, John, about the matting material. So what is the matting material? It may look like plastic, but how does water get through to the plants?
Yeah, so there's it's very tiny perforations within the material, and it almost looks like a landscape fabric, but it's porous. So, and the water does soak through really quickly. We use them on a different site that we water quite a bit, and it goes right through. And then it's supposed to, it's kind of a punched material, so it's supposed to inhibit evaporation back the other way. So you put them shiny side up, and then it basically keeps moisture from escaping, is the idea. And they are pretty tough. We tried matting an area prior to harvesting the overwood, and we had about a foot of snow on the ground, and only the mats that were right on the skidder trail were raked up. The others made it through. If there had been just one pull over the top, they managed to get through and make it.
Great. And a couple of questions about costs. So do you have any idea about the cost per acre for maybe kind of the suite of things you've been trying at St. John's, both maybe for the fencing, and then in addition to that, the matting as well?
Yep. So the fencing in area is the cheapest. It's about $1 a foot. And so if you work out your perimeter, that's about what it comes to. And we use the 9-foot fence. So you buy an 8-foot woven wire fence, and then you basically run a high tensile smooth wire along the top to get your next foot. And the DNR actually has a really good, let's see if I can pull it up, share my screen here. A woven fencing handbook for 10-foot woven wire deer exclusion fence. So that gives you all the details on how to build the fence. And we found cost-wise, we'd go with a 9-foot fence. They recommend 10-foot fence for 100% exclusion. They say a 9-foot fence is 90% effective. And we have had one or two in, but we watch them pretty regularly and can get them out of there pretty quickly. So I would recommend a 9-foot fence with the high tensile wire for the last foot. You get 12-foot posts, and then you stick 3 in the ground and then 9 up, because 12-foot posts are quite a bit less expensive than a 14-foot post. So And then the doing individual cages is about twice as expensive. I found it's about $6 to $7 per tree, which is a lot for the first year, but you can reuse them again and again and again. So we're kind of in this for the long haul. So every time you reuse them, the price goes down in half. So the mats are about $1 a piece. And I'm not sure we haven't had them out long enough to know how long they're going to last. I'm guessing it's just going to be a one tree method on the mats. And I'm trying to think what else. And the tubes, I don't have cost rate in front of me, but those are the kind of the fencing costs.
Thanks, John. While we're talking about tree tubes, one comment from someone, I have tried 6-foot tree tubes vented, but have had problems. They're expensive, lots of labor to install, wind blows them down, trees don't seem to do well in them. I'm now looking at 3-foot tree tubes and bud capping when trees come out on top. Do you have any comments on that approach?
That sounds like a good, yeah, I don't know. We've tried the 6-foot tubes and had kind of similar, I'm not as a big fan of the results we've had. I have not tried 3-foot tubes. You must be planning, I don't know if you're planning, I don't know if you're bud capping the deciduous trees, but if you find a method that works for that, if you're doing conifers, I found a mesh. I've used just kind of an open mesh, and I move it up the pole with the leader. So I basically, you get a 4-foot pole, and then I bud cap after the mesh gets to the 4-foot mark, because then there's enough side branches on the conifers that the deer will just browse the sides and they won't go after the bud cap on the top. So I guess I haven't tried a half-size tube yet, and I would like to hear if that works on a deciduous like a oak. But I don't know if it's burnout within, they are vented, the ones we have as well, so I'm thinking it's not burnout, but I don't know exactly what the problem is with the tubes.
Great. Thanks. Also want to invite Christel to respond to this question about soils that we have come in. Do you know of any studies that investigate the palatability differences within a species based on soil type? For example, is there a difference in white cedar palatability on organic muck soils versus mineral or upland soils?
Yeah, offhand, I do not know a study like that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I know there are studies looking at, planted seedlings coming from the nursery and natural tree generation, and the trees preferring, if that's the same species, the trees coming from the nursery because they are in very nutrient-rich conditions grown at the nursery over the more nutrient-poor conditions of the natural tree regeneration. So offhand, don't know a study on that, but it would make sense of the soils influencing the palatability of the species.
Great, thanks. And then more broadly, kind of across the lake states, is there a herd reduction strategy in place along with trying different kinds of silvicultural trials?
I don't know that one. Maybe Christel, I don't know if you can chime in on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll mention, I know, well, as an example, in Minnesota, we have the recent deer management plan. That's kind of a statewide look at deer management. But yeah, that doesn't necessarily get to local areas to that. But I guess maybe kind of more locally, what about on St. John's, John, in terms of what's your deer management hunting on the property?
Sure. So we've held a controlled deer hunt since 1998, and we started out with a shotgun. We have a shotgun season, but we found that very cost prohibitive because we had to basically shut down the woods, and a lot of costs with security, just checking in hunters and checking them out. So then we went to a archery hunt where we have about 100 to 120 archers come in, and it's a lottery system. We typically get about the hunters get about 30 to 35 deer per year, but we are totally surrounded by agricultural land mixed with forest. It's just perfect deer edge habitat with plenty of food. So the deer population kind of just rides steady despite pretty heavy hunting pressure in the area. They're so successful that we have reduced it. I mean, I remember as a student in the 90s, I'd be helping on a harvest, and you'd see 40 deer come out of the woods to eat the tops in the winter. It was the yard for them, and just really high population. So we have been successful in taking that down quite a bit. I've seen dogwood start to pop up in a few areas, so it's having an impact. But I think just socially, deer hunting is such a big part of the people's lives in this area that if you tried to take down deer populations to the levels like 5 to 10 per square mile, there would be resistance to that.
Good. Another question for Christel about deer repellent, and you had mentioned that as an approach that folks are trying. So what are the results of using deer repellent in the forest?
When I was interacting with the Chippewa National Forest, for example, that was a strategy that they were using to protect seedlings. They're using these in sites where they're planting red pine, jack pine, white pine, and they would in the fall use plant skid, one of the repellents, and that was successful for them in that area. For the available food sources for the deer, that made sense for them, and so they would reapply this every fall until the trees were out of browse height. So as a researcher, I'm not actively implementing all these ideas myself, but I'm working with managers like yourselves on strategies to do this and monitor the effects of these different approaches.
I can add in just a little bit. Tom Kroll here prior to me as a land manager, he actually tried applying it from the air on over kind of a few acre parcel just to see if he could keep deer out of a particular area, and it was not effective. I think you just have to keep reapplying that too much to make a large area feasible. For instance, after every rain or after every few rains.
Another question maybe for you both. Some managers specifically break off or cut their oak seedlings to take advantage of their taproot investment. What do you think about considering full site brush mowing or an understory clear cut or some other similar treatment to release the oaks?
I can chime in on that. We have, it seems like you need at least 3 years of growth, I think, on natural regen to have enough energy in the root to rebound after a brush cut, to really rebound faster than the competition. They do come back, but they're kind of measly, and you kind of get into this vicious cycle where they're not getting up fast enough to beat out the competition. So we have done just brush cut off everything, and we do get some oaks to come back, but you need a few years of growth before they really take off like crazy.
Great. And I don't know, Christel, any thoughts on the cutting seedlings to take advantage of the taproot?
No, I don't have additional comments.
Well, a few more questions, lots of questions still coming in, and still encourage folks to type them in and we'll relay them. But a question for John, going back to some of the old deer exclusion studies that Tom Kroll established, what are the condition of them? So this person says some of them must be over 15 years old now.
Yeah, so there was one that was our oldest one was a 1/4 acre. It was put in by Father Paul Schweitz. It was the very first one, and that was 20 years old this year. And we actually just took the overwood off it last winter, and the seedlings within that were about 8 feet tall. They were fighting with, there had been no work within that exclosure to kind of keep the ironwood back. So there are pockets along the fence actually that made it pretty well because they're getting sunlight from the edge of the fence. And so they're about 8 foot tall right now and look great. So I'm just, it's working, you know, a deer exclosure works. I'm just trying to speed it up a little bit so it doesn't take 20 years to get to an 8-foot tree. So that's why I'm putting in the work on the mats and the releasing, almost doing the hand release around each tree.
Great. And as a follow-up, John, a question from someone that's working on the Superior National Forest. They use grass mats and 9-foot cages along the North Shore. Those would only be planted at about 20 to 50 trees per acre. It's a lot of work to maintain the cages, and we've added that work to our TSI contracts. And so very interesting. But in general, kind of, I guess as you look at the work you're doing with the mats, John, but in general, does it look promising to establish oaks?
Yeah, it really does. And I'm curious. The clear cut method was my hope that would work really well because I don't like removing the overwood later and having to break off everything that you've been working towards. And that initially those plantings were a little slow to start up, but they're starting to rebound now because it's a hot, dry site when you clear cut. And it's really crucial on those first few weeks that you have the right moisture to get those little seedlings, planted seedlings especially, going. So it does look promising. The mats are holding up really well. They're keeping the competition out, and they're really easy to buzz around with a brush saw around the outside and knock everything back. So I think I'm going to have to do that twice a summer. But yeah, I'm pretty excited about the results we've had so far.
Great. And Christel, you had mentioned bud capping, particularly a strategy that private landowners are doing. Someone writes, there is a deciduous bud capping method. Sometimes I recommend applying repellent to the cap in places where deer are pulling off the caps. And then another comment, I've recommended applying repellent to the cap where deer are pulling them off. So any thoughts on that, either Christel or John, about using both repellents and bud caps on deciduous trees?
Sounds like a good strategy.
I would like to know more. How do you get it to stay on?
That's great. I'm hoping Kelly can maybe provide some more detail in how she's doing that.
Yeah, I would love that because it works. Bud capping works really well on our conifers. But yeah, if you could, that would be awesome.
While we're on the topic of repellents, are there any studies on systemic repellents used where the conifer takes a repellent up over time through their roots? And any studies on a granular repellent that could be used or applied aerially?
I worked up in Boulder Lake Environmental Learning Center prior to this, and they had a white pine study where they put in the tablets by the root system, and that would be a great addition to the silviculture library. I know that's been in now for about 6 years, and I'm not sure of the results on that, but maybe something to add, Eli, to the mix, or Matt.
Great. Another comment about the Minnesota DNR in the south. I guess that's the southeastern part of the state. They will plant oak seedlings a few years prior to harvest. Once the area is harvested, many will break off and regenerate from the roots or short shoot. When the slash is left behind at 6-foot high levels, it acts as a barrier to deer, adding further protection. So I don't know if there are any thoughts by the two of you about that approach.
I really like that because we do have there's a lot of slash, and I'm really working hard to usually get it out of there for planting, but that's another great idea that you could get those oaks going prior in the shelter wood, and then almost build a natural fence around a lot of them. I like that.
Yeah, Matt, it almost feels like with all these great comments and questions that we're generating a list of management strategies, and then also a list of research questions that could be addressed. So this is a great discussion. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, I think I'm going to jump in too. This is Eli Sagor, just to partly second what Christel just said. I totally agree. And John, we will follow up on the Boulder Lake case study. That sounds terrific. I appreciate your mentioning that. And I just want to put a plug out for anyone else who's trying something interesting, or maybe trying something that lots of people do. We would love to hear your stories and to be able to publish those on the Silviculture Library. John, going to the discussion about the bud capping on deciduous trees that you and Kelly Smith have been going back and forth kind of indirectly on. John, were you asking, you were interested in Kelly's approach, and were you asking how do you keep the bud cap on the deciduous seedling, or were you asking how you keep the repellent from kind of washing away off of the bud cap? I know some of those are water soluble.
No, I was the first one. So just how do you keep it on the deciduous twig itself?
And Kelly did reply to that, and he had a good method. I don't think Matt has mentioned this yet, so I'll just say, since I'm here, he says place a staple in the crotch of a twig to keep it from falling down. Place other staples near the main stem rather than along the edges and corners of the cap. So if I'm interpreting that right, it's using the crotch, but also kind of some tension, to kind of tighten that bud cap against it.
Yeah, like a sleeve. Okay.
Yeah. Kelly had another comment saying, I wonder if for logging prescriptions, cribbing placement should be added to account for regen. Wonder if Christel or John have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I haven't used cribbing at all, but I'm interested to see what kind of formation you could make that would be most effective to kind of protect a large area or lines or swaths. I don't know much about that, but I'm going to find out more. If anyone knows anything out there, I would love to hear.
Did you have a comment, Christel?
Oh, I was just going to say that I think it's a newer strategy and a different way to think. So the more people that try it and we share ideas, the better we can hone in on when that is useful and when it's not useful.
Great. And I do want to catch just a couple more questions coming in. Going back to tree tubes, John had mentioned the plastic tree tubes that they've been using, but what about mesh tree tubes? Would those work well for oaks?
I think we're going to try it. You have to have a fine enough mesh, though, that keeps the branches within the mesh. Otherwise, you end up with a mess as they come out through every side. So having a fine enough mesh that you could kind of keep raising up alongside a pole on that lead branch would be the key. So that's something we're going to try next year as well.
And as a follow-up to that, John, in terms of what's been going on at St. John's at the Arboretum, have you or Tom ever before planted acorns instead of going to the time and expense of growing seedlings in the nursery and then planting those seedlings? So the first part of that question is, have you ever tried planting acorns? The second part is, how old are the seedlings when you plant them?
So The seedlings we get are 2 to 3 years old, and we have tried just only in one spot though. We tried just planting them, just hand planting the acorns, and it didn't work out as well as we had hoped. I would like I'm toying around with the ideas of just lightly either moving our cut up, when the ground's just slightly frozen. So as we're working around in the area, if we drive those acorns into the ground just with our skidder as we're kind of going around and working up the area. I know up north for white pine, they use an anchor chain and drag that just to get scarification of the soil. But we haven't tried just direct planting that much. But our problem really isn't getting regen, it's getting it from seedling to sapling. So I guess we do get quite a bit of natural regen on our fresh shelterwood cuts. It's mainly these rehab areas where we have a lot of ironwood, where we're going back in and trying, that's where we're planting. So.
Great. Seeing another comment, another approach that's being tried on our county forest. We have just started the process of a study with the Wisconsin DNR. It will entail fencing in a small group clear cut, as well as scarifying the soil. And so an interesting approach going on in that county forest. I don't know if you have any comments on that approach.
I would like, Matt, could you tell me who that was? Just so I'd like to connect with them, because that's...
Yep, that was Jordan Lutz
Okay.
had sent that message.
Cool. I'll follow up with you, Jordan. Like to hear more.
Well, I'm doing a scan through the comments, of which there are many. A lot of great questions and comments. I agree with others. This is great to have, and we'll save this at least for us to kind of make sure we have all this recorded. And so we'll be sure to share those questions too. But otherwise, not seeing any more comments, not seeing any more questions come in. I think we'll conclude today's webinar. And really just want to highlight that a lot of the work going on with the Great Lakes Silviculture Library has been funded through the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and then specifically the Renewable Resources Extension Act. That's really helped to fund a lot of the development of this case studies, a lot of the time that many of us in Extension and other organizations at the University of Minnesota, University of Wisconsin are doing. So I do want to mention the support for this project. So I wanted to mention that, and also our webinar next month. Next month on August 21st, there'll be an update to the DNR's Sustainable Timber Harvest Analysis. Many of you may know, several months ago, the DNR came out with their results from that Sustainable Timber Harvest Analysis. And so we'll be getting kind of an update about where things are, the results that were found in that harvest analysis, and kind of what the DNR is doing to implement that strategy. And so that's coming up next month on August 21st. And so with that, I want to thank Christel and John for the great discussions we've had this afternoon. And with that, we'll sign off, and thank you for joining our webinar today.